I think we're out of chairs.
Well, this is a pretty sizable crowd for this evening's presentation. I'd like to welcome you all to the Archives and History Library for tonight's presentation. I'd like to also go over a few things that are upcoming that is going to be wonderful. On March 5th, we have the history of Charleston with Dr. Billy Joe Payton, and he is here tonight. I think maybe somewhere in this crowd, possibly. I seen him earlier today. I'm not sure. Is Billy Joe here? Maybe not, but I seen him earlier today. On April the 2nd, we have the West Virginia State College Aviation Program, and that will be good with Dr. Charles Ledbetter. May 7th, Reconstructing Bill, the story of Governor William C. Marlin with Russ Barber. June 4th, Dixie's Daughters, United Daughters of the Confederacy with Dr. Karen Cox. July 2nd, Rock Spring Park with Joseph A. Com. And then I tell you, we have also on the Thursday night programs, we've got coming up here, let's see if I can find my programs here. On March 14th, we are very fortunate to have something very exciting coming up. We've got Doug Wood, and Doug is here this evening because I did see him. I think he just put a green coat over his head. Okay, he's going to do something that's very exciting, and it is the roots of the Uncivil War, the 250th anniversary of Cornstalk's campaign. And I think that that's going to be just a wonderful presentation, so you all can't miss that one. And back again, by popular demand, guess what? Greg Carroll will be back with African American research.
I say you get the theater again.
Well, we might have to do something. I don't know what we're going to do there. But I would like to thank you all for coming out. It's been a beautiful day. It's History Day at the legislature. We've had a great day with all of our history heroes, and it's been just a wonderful day. And at this point, with my voice about gone with winter weather, I would like to introduce tonight's presentation. Greg Carroll, a longtime staff member of the Archives and History Library, retired at the end of October of this year. He's back to present Native American research, and he's going to go over, he will discuss this evening their languages, alliances, tribal movements, and he will also, one of the reasons I wanted to have him back, he is going to try to also discuss the research, and that is something that he was our staff research expert, really. When he left, he took a lot of knowledge with him, so we're all ears tonight, just as you can see how popular that research is. So make welcome Greg Carroll.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that seating was, turned out what it was. We were, I would say, unprepared, would be an understatement. And now we have a little peanut gallery up here that I kind of like, but you'll have to watch me from the rear. But I'm going to turn around and talk to you all too occasionally, okay? And everybody that can hear in the back, I'm going to speak rather loudly and my voice booms. I don't think you'll have a problem understanding me. Can everybody hear us?
Yes.
Is that okay? Well, good evening. I'm glad to see everyone, of course. I'm also happy to be back in my old haunts here at the Archives Library. I hope we can get through a lot of information tonight. And also have time for many questions. If you decide that I'm saying something you're going to question, write your question down, remember it, and we'll go to it after the discussion, and we'll have some time to answer questions also, okay? The subject is vast, and we must try and concentrate on our specific geographical area. There's also a certain set of time, historical periods that we're going to have to try to concentrate on. We can't talk about everything, as you all well know. Ma'am. Oh, more. Well, we can put them right here. Yeah, sit right here. Come on in. Yes, you're right ahead. Come on in, there's 2 seats right there.
Anybody need another sheet?
Actually, Wayne, you were going to find yourself a seat somewhere. There it comes. Flip that right over, you come on over here. I hope this will not be too frustrating and that I will not be moving too fast as we talk, because we're already loaded with a huge subject. We also are going to literally have to go through a whole series of time periods that some of y'all might not be aware of, the earlier time periods. I've passed out, I've got a little packet, and some people have packets and some don't. Looks like Kathy might actually have a packet.
Yeah, we've got some
Back there.
stuff back here if anybody wants to.
And here's the thing about the packets we've passed out tonight. We couldn't copy enough for everyone. Naturally, if you come back into the archives, you'll be able to get a packet here anytime you want, because we will have them here for you to pick up. They're not going to be anywhere out of sight. We'll have them right here at the front. You can pick up a Native American packet anytime you come back. I'm going to say right off the bat that I am no expert in any technical meaning of that word, and will quickly give precedence to our actual experts in the audience. Bob's not here tonight, is he? Bob Maslowski, Dr. Maslowski, famous for his research in Adena and Hopewell mound builders. But we do have Mr. Doug Wood, which we've already laughed at over there, because he is a real expert on the Shawnee and the Cherokee tribes, and I am lucky to have learned as much as I have from these gentlemen. Doug is extremely multi-talented, as you may already know. I want to make some general statements about our Native American presence by reminding everyone that the neat divisions laid out in charts and graphs that separate the cultural and tribal regions are really very inexact and will always blend from one period to the next. Native American cultures and societies have always morphed into new and different paradigms over the centuries, sometimes in quick jumps, but usually in slowly evolving changes that cannot be exactly delineated. Most scientists will agree to that now. I also want to say that due to our short time here, we will not go into the interesting subjects like when, where, and how the native people first came onto the North American continent and how they may have spread across to our area. That is a lengthy and controversial subject that we just don't have time to discuss here, but it's interesting. I also hope that you might also follow along as we progress by occasionally consulting your maps there. You'll see some of the areas I'm referring to. I also hope that you'll forgive me. Most people now present their lectures with PowerPoint demonstrations. PowerPoint pictures and beautiful, colorful illustrations. I admit that I am a little old school, and I prefer to have a dialogue one-to-one with y'all, looking at me when you can, and not have it to be a TV show or a documentary that you might see on public TV. And for that, I apologize, because I will eventually, of course, have to buckle under to the pressure, and if I'm ever asked back, I will have to eventually produce the obligatory, colorful, and dazzling PowerPoint demonstration. I will do so later, not tonight. So we're going to be talking person to person here, and I kind of prefer it that way. Unfortunately, you have to look at my talking head, so we'll all be conversing. Let's begin this historical journey with the development of the Adena culture sphere, lasting from about 800 BC to 100 BC. I would describe this sphere not as a conquered area, but simply as a cultural interaction stretching all the way from Indiana clear to New England. With its base in the Ohio Valley, the Adena were building mounds as burial sites with beautiful artifacts included. The possible influence of the great Mesoamerican Indian culture from Mexico and Central America could have made an influence. That's debated all the time now. I would say that there are many similarities and there are many differences, and that decision has not been finalized, but it's an interesting area of archaeology and anthropology. Did the Mayans and the Olmecs have influence up here in our area? I would say there's probably some, but the amount is difficult to define. The Adena gave way slowly to the Hopewell, but even this change and differentiation cannot be made as a line drawn in the sand, like a president gets elected and after 4 years another president is elected. That's not the case with a Native American history. You know, the trading area that we call these cultural exchanges, the Native people were a lot more active and moved around a lot more than a lot of people realize. The situation with trading partners, they were oftentimes trading things like tobacco. I will say that tobacco that was smoked by the Adena and Hopewell, because we find so many of their pipes, that tobacco was literally not like the modern tobacco that we have. It contained several hallucinogens. It was 5 to 10 times as much powerful in nicotine as our present day cigarettes, for instance, and it certainly gave a psychoactive kick. The Adena sites in West Virginia include Grave Creek, the Creel Mound, areas like that. It is important to note that the Adena was one of the first Eastern cultures to use a full array of crops. Doug's going to be embarrassed here because I'm going to tell people to talk to him about these. These plants were actually domesticated and, of course, harvested in the wild. But crops like marsh elder, crops like knotweed, maygrass, and little barley. Though these plants still exist, they are now considered just weeds. Doug can talk about these crops, and I'm eager to go on one of his hikes where he can show us how to pick and perhaps even cook some of these. He's laughing about that cooking part. But one must remember that maize, corn, was not one of these domesticated crops. That had not reached this area until later. And the earliest corn was very small, with very few rows, and not as popular a crop as it was to become later. Coming after the Adena is the Hopewell culture, which some scientists feel may be just a later stage of the Adena. They also built mounds and traded all across the eastern and even western North America, garnering products like obsidian from as far away as Yellowstone. Naturally, you'll find in Ohio sites, you'll find seashells from the Gulf Coast and from the Atlantic Coast. Their exports included the bow and arrow, which was extremely important, as you well know. Things like fired pottery were very important. And naturally, their monumental earthworks, which may have given some inspiration to the later famous Cahokian complexes, which are later than the Hopewell. The Hopewell flowering was a very exuberant and really, it was the kind of thing that was so energized and so vast that the Hopewell people are kind of known as passionate folks. I like to think of them that way. You'd have to have a lot of passion to convince all your neighbors to spend 15 years building an Indian mound. That does take some passion, as you might figure. The use of the bow and arrow, of course, people always wonder, when did that happen? How did that happen? Well, it was spread in the same kind of trading networks that we see develop in the Adena and that are further exploited in the Hopewell culture. Obviously, they had built a stratified society. If you're going to bury someone in a mound covered in pearls with slabs of expensive copper all over them, those leaders had to be living in a stratified society. They had to be raised on pedestals. So those chiefs were beginning to live in much more stratified societies. I also would like to mention that they had created a persuasive religious myth, and those religious myths and symbols you'll find oftentimes the eagle, the birds that are made out of mica, a variety of wonderful art objects. Those were spread by the Hopewell culture. It is during the later phases of Hopewell and the beginnings of the Mississippian that we see maize, corn, become very popular, especially in its new northern Flint version, which was cold resistant. So you can see the Indians are developing corn, and as the right corn plant works, well, that's the corn they use as seed. And that spreads a cold resistant form, which changed their whole society, as you might be able to figure, because corn is easily stored. And that makes a huge difference. Also imagine marsh elder trying to feed your family with something that is the size of sesame seeds. Well, how many sesame seeds would you have to eat to have a healthy family? A lot of sesame seeds. I like sesame seeds, but you'd have to have a lot of them. As we move on, we describe the next cultural wave as Mississippian. Mississippian. It developed over several centuries after the decline of the Hopewell, and maybe its distant descendants. Once again, these cultures developed mostly in river bottoms and established trade networks that reached far from their bases. The Cahokia complex was the center of this vast network, and it became the largest city north of the Rio Grande, reaching its peak from about 950 to 1250 AD. I haven't visited the Cahokian complex yet, but it's over in St. Louis area, and I'm looking forward to going there and seeing it. It's supposed to be very interesting. Monk's Mound is 120 feet high or something huge. And that process is one where a large stratified society had to convince people that weren't slaves These were not slaves. The tribal members that built a mound that big, they did it voluntarily. So that's an interesting concept. Cahokia was devastated later by earthquake, and it had flooding. And some believe that Cahokia had a very serious civil war, and they went into decline. With this decline of the Mississippian culture, we begin to see a diffusion of Indian peoples that we can recognize as the cultures that were identified when the first European invasions began. Collectively called Eastern Woodland people. The oldest, cultures that we can define, we have to give names that are not Indian names. Hopewell and Adena are not Native American words or names. They're names simply given by archaeologists when they discover a certain site. Hopewell and Adena are names that were used because the sites close by were named that. Ohio, Hopewell area, for instance. The main way that scientists separate these more modern tribes will be by language divisions, and there are 4 main groupings or families. And as I list these 4, I will give you an idea of some of the tribes that they were included. The oldest and most widespread appears to be the Eastern Algonquian language groups, represented by tribes like the Powhatan, the Huron, the Shawnee, the Ottawa, the Ojibwa, the Delaware, etc., etc., many more. Most of these tribes claim to have moved east into the areas they occupied, but who they may have displaced is somewhat ambiguous. So you have to realize that there are not any easy answers when you're dealing with Native American tribal movements. Language is the thing that the anthropologist must hold on to. You got to hold on to something because there is no written language. The Native Americans do not have a written language that we can grasp. Next language family group, we have Muskogee, represented by tribes like the Creeks, the Seminoles, Choctaws, etc. These people were mostly found in the southern states of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana. Next, I'm going to mention Siouan, represented by tribes like the Tutelo, the Saponi, the Monacan, the Catawba. Some researchers think that the Kanawha Valley may have had Monacan and Tutelo people living in this area before the disruptions caused by the European invasions. Folks, that means right here where we're sitting, there could have been Monacan, Saponi, Tutelo people living in small villages, eating fish out of the river, which they could do then, I wouldn't recommend it now. And they literally were where we are standing at this very moment. The related language to Siouan is the Iroquois language. And it's a distant relation, but they are related. It naturally includes the Iroquois and, surprisingly enough, the Cherokee. That kind of surprised me when I first read it many years ago. The Cherokee language is Iroquoian in its base, in its family base. Both these tribes seem to intrude on areas that were largely Algonquian originally. But the most recent scholarship demonstrates that these tribes may have been in their areas much longer than first thought, possibly earlier than 1300 AD. So it's hard to say exactly when the Iroquois and the Cherokee moved into these areas, but they appear to have taken over some of the Algonquian tribal areas. And as we will see later, the warfare between the Iroquois, the Huron, various other Algonquian-speaking tribes takes place really from the very beginning, very early on. These tribes were no longer living in large cities. By now they had dispersed in small villages. They were less stratified. They did not have as many detailed workers that did things like the copper and the stuff that you see earlier in Adena and Hopewell. The interesting part about the Algonquian people and the Iroquois are, to a lesser degree, they unified during the spring and summer to plant their corn and their crops and to socialize. But during the fall and winter, they began to disperse into much smaller areas, much smaller bands. Hunting bands made it easier to feed your family. So these tribes were usually only in large villages. Chillicothe is a good example of a large Shawnee village, which they would have inhabited mainly during the spring and the summer. And then they have the famous green corn celebration, which was held each summer when the green corn was ready to eat. So it was a big social celebration. These tribes seem to, be gone from certain areas at certain times. But I can tell you that movements of the tribes are a very difficult proposition to try to delineate. Take tribes like the Shawnee. I'm just using them as an example. They had so many tribes. They had so many connections. Some scientists try to figure it out, and some of them just say, well, they like to walk around. I can only say that they walked clear to Savannah, Georgia from the Ohio River. They walked from Savannah clear to areas like the woods of western Pennsylvania. So you have the Shawnee as an example of tribes that traveled around. I would defer to Doug on many of these questions, but I think that the Shawnee were oftentimes used as a warrior zone to go in between two different fighting tribes. And you place a Shawnee band inside that area and it creates a neutral zone. A lot of people didn't want to face the Shawnee, understandably. Culturally speaking, these diverse tribes are similar in their basic living styles, raising corn in the spring and summer, and then dispersing into smaller hunting bands in the winter. After all this vast telescoping of time and cultures we've been talking about here over the past few minutes, we need to talk about where the tribes that were living in our area. First, let's deal with the myth that there were no Indians living in West Virginia when the first Europeans arrived here. It is true that there may have been fewer native people because of the terrible diseases that had ravaged eastern North America, starting with the vicious Spaniard, De Soto, and his pig herd. I'm not sure if y'all know that story about De Soto, of course. In our history books, it's always explorers, He viciously looked for gold and literally bumped into various tribes, destroying people and spreading disease as he went. And De Soto's inheritance with the native peoples is terrible. Measles, smallpox, and those pigs carried disease also. And of course, even De Soto himself eventually died of a fever along the Mississippi. I can only say that was a horrifying time period. Some scientists believe that the native people in America, the Native Americans, were even more susceptible to diseases because they appeared to die in greater numbers than the Europeans did, even in the Black Plague. Now, those figures and facts are hard to verify. Some of them are suppositions. I can only say that that's a lot of people dying in the eastern seaboard. While we speak, I'm going to simply point out my map over here that I always use. I always tell people about this one. Right behind showing you a map that is done by the National Geographic, which I trust. And I want y'all to look at this before you leave to see the dark areas, which are vast and multivarious tribes and cultures. And then that's 1491, before Columbus. And in 1650, you see almost a massive removal of these people from measles, smallpox, influenza, diseases that were very prevalent after DeSoto and after the white invasions. I can only say that you should look at this map before you leave. Just take a look at it, because it's pretty stark. It's pretty scary, okay, folks? Take a look at this later. Here in West Virginia, of course, there is also the unfortunate reality that Indians had a tendency to back away from the warrior paths. And a lot of folks know what I'm referring to. The warrior paths ran on both sides of the mountains, mostly southwest up to northeast. Oftentimes, young Cherokee warriors would go up and steal women from the Iroquois people, or vice versa. That warrior path had very active young warriors on it a lot, and tribes had a tendency to back away from that area. And I can see why they did so. Having trails that went mostly southwest to northeast meant that right through West Virginia on both sides of the mountain range, you had warrior paths that were not areas where tribes wanted to settle much in. I just point that out. Many of these tribes also, as I have told you, would pull back across the Ohio and coalesce in large villages during the spring and summer. Well, this was the same time that usually white settlers and explorers and trappers and traders would come into West Virginia, and what did they see? No Indians. This is where this myth starts from. The Shawnee people, for instance, suddenly would come back in the fall into their hunting grounds, their areas where their society lived and hunted, and find a bunch of white people. You can imagine how they felt about that time. And this is when the warfare between the whites and the red people start in earnest. The Shawnee were none too pleased, of course, but the white folks felt like they had entered a virgin forest and there was nothing here to block them. So you begin to see rationales back and forth on both sides of this question. I choose this moment to speak about what I consider a very white notion, the noble savage. Our Indian people are often described in many writings by the dominant white culture as near perfect stewards of the land, early environmentalists, living in exact harmony with nature, etc. I think it's important to see these cultures as they really were, not as idealized ideas. These versions are very romantically involved. Native people were known to burn large swaths of the forests of North America for thousands of years to promote cleared areas and to drive game into easy slaughter. And all of us would understand that if you were trying to feed your family. The fact is that they were good land managers. They were doing what they felt was the right thing to do, especially when they had cleared properties after the grasslands would come in, and the deer were easier to find, the deer were easier to kill on these meadow-like areas. In fact, the first European comments when seeing the, in quotes, virgin forests were how sparse they were and how cleared the land seemed to be. It was after the horrible epidemics of measles, smallpox, etc., that seriously reduced the population across eastern North America that these virgin forests began to grow back. Equally interesting is things like the return of the wood buffalo. You have towns like Buffalo, New York. Well, people think, well, there's no buffaloes in Buffalo, New York. Well, there used to be. There used to be. As these populations would go downward, as disease damaged many of the tribes, both the forests and the buffalo came back. The Indian tribes all across the Midwest had tried to keep the buffalo from coming east into their cornfields. They did not want large herds of buffalo into their cornfields. And so that's one reason. It's interesting that the paths made by these buffaloes can often be seen in our modern highways. And I've heard many times, Doug might know the difference, I've heard many times that Highway 60 was once a buffalo trail, a trail made by the big buffaloes as they went clear over to the eastern seaboard. As one can imagine, these herds were a source of food, which was good, but it was hard to pull them down until the Native Americans had guns. Has anybody seen any of the interesting wood buffalo herds? I call them wood buffalo. They're down in Kentucky, land between the lakes. They have one. And there's one up by the area of Horse Cave in Kentucky. Has anybody seen those? Anyway, they're small herds, but I've seen them several times. And it's interesting to see the buffalo that you identify, of course, with the prairie, out there on the plains. It's interesting to see these buffalo with a huge forest right behind them. They're in a woodland. And that's the kind of symbol we used to see all the time here. The famous Tecumseh was known to kill buffalo with an arrow, with his arrows. His bows and arrows were able to bring down many buffalo. And in many ways, he may be the last one to shoot buffalo with arrows. Tecumseh was doing that over in the plains of Ohio. As the white invasion took over Western Virginia, the Indians fought back in a series of vicious wars. Clear from the 1620s to the War of 1812. Our Indian people were forced to play a balancing act between the New World empires of Spain, France, and England for 200 years. And they did so with skill and determination. Very difficult political situations they were placed in. And whenever you read the various diplomatic messages passed by French, Spanish, English, they'd send their people in, expecting, of course, for these Indians to be just childlike, We'll just explain to them how they have to get out of the way and then we'll take their property. They found very sophisticated political decision-making process in the Indian tribes. They were oftentimes put off and oftentimes angered because the Indians knew how to talk back to these people. And I place that as one of the ways they survived for as long as they did. Their diplomatic skill. They had to come up, of course, later, though, against us Americans. That was a little different. We didn't have an empire stretching back to London or Paris. We had, 5,000 Germans coming straight over it from Pennsylvania, or Scotch-Irish loading into the mountains, The Shawnee could kill 500 of them. The next thing you know, there'd be 5,000 more. The native people considered it a blight upon the land, naturally. And I think we can all at least identify with that. History and technology were not on their side. They were constantly attracted to the new products that the Europeans brought with them. Things like pots and pans. Think how valuable pots and pans would be. Cloth. to give to your wife to make various clothing. It's amazing because when you really read the stories, even things like tea and chocolate were popular with the tribes. You can see how that created a juxtaposition inside their social structure. The white people are coming to take their land, but I'd like to get some of those guns and ammunition they've got. So you're both drawn and repelled by the white culture. Unfortunately, they recognize this a little too late. You can see many of the tribes begging for various fur trading, for various outposts to come into their area, and the next thing you know, they've all got smallpox. Or, the next thing you know, they're all addicted to gunpowder. Gotta have gunpowder. Can't use those bow and arrow anymore. It's a lot easier to use that rifle. That musket helps. That is the juxtaposition that the tribes are faced with culturally. The fur trade I wish to discuss also, because many of y'all have read about the fur trade. If you ever want to read anything bizarrely complex, read about how beaver pelts were used. Taken from the Huron, given to right over there to the Iroquois that served as a buffer. They had to pay the Iroquois. The Iroquois would give it to the Dutch. The Dutch would give it to the British. The British would sail over and give it to the Dutch in Amsterdam. The Amsterdam Dutch fur traders would then sell it to the Russians, who would do the curing, and after the Russians did the curing, they would sell it for hats in London. Suddenly, the native people are right in the middle of a global trading structure. They don't know it all, but they are connected intimately to that global structure. And that global structure has good things and very bad things, both. And they are faced with both those unfortunate realities. The fur trade also damaged many tribes like the Huron. The Huron were forced to compete with the Iroquois, and the Iroquois didn't like it that the Huron had more access to the furs than they did. Next thing you know, Iroquois got muskets given to them by the Dutch. The Dutch say, go ahead, go get us some furs. The next thing you know, the Iroquois are attacking the Huron, the Erie, various other tribes in that area. They even destroyed really most of the Huron. The Huron then later become the Wyandot, which is a remnant band, the Wyandot, from the Huron. As the white invasion comes on, though, you can see that there is both a desperate attempt to get those white products and a desperate attempt to keep the whites out. The Ohio River eventually became a basic frontier where mainly the Shawnee, but you can also put the Wyandot and the Delaware and Potawatomi and various other tribes there, tried to hold the Ohio as a frontier line. We can tell how long that lasted. Whenever the settlers began to build boats up in the Pittsburgh area, they'd float those boats all the way down and go clear into Kentucky and grab as much land as they could. Oh, nobody owns this land. That was the rationale, of course. Oh, the British lost this land when we won the Revolution. That kind of rationale. The Shawnee never signed any treaty that said they lost Kentucky. They just lost it by the power of the gun, where political power comes out of the end of a gun. That's the story that I always tell. And the need for guns and ammunition forced them to make decisions and political alliances that they would not normally wish to make. Think about the battle between the British and the Americans during the Revolution. Many of the Indian tribes did not want to fight on either side, but they were forced to take sides by the various powerful entities that were going to take over their land one way or the other. For our area, the Battle of Point Pleasant is a culmination of this conflict between the red and the white people. I highly recommend you go seeing the wonderful murals that were painted on the Point Pleasant flood walls by my friend Robert Dafford. Has anybody seen the murals yet? There at least some folks have seen the murals. They're pretty good, aren't they? They're world-class murals. They show the battle, and they also show the cultural. They, for instance, have a really beautiful Shawnee tribal area drawn out on that. And I think they're going to be one of the biggest tourist attractions in the area one of these days. They show also the immense effort the Virginians had to make to invade the Ohio Valley and the heroic Indian response. Cornstalk's assassination is depicted very tragically, very heroic depiction of his assassination 2 years later after the 1774 battle at Point Pleasant. Consider all the number of Indian names in our state. When you look at words like Kanawha, Monongahela, Pocahontas, Logan, there's also been some interesting work on Indian trails that went all across West Virginia. I'm going to hold this book up. If you take a look here, you'll see Professor Hickman has done some really good maps of Indian trails in our area, and you can see right where they are because he's got them all mapped out. I recommend taking a look at these books. Pretty good. That's about 10 years old, that scholarship. There have been some growing awareness that many of us have Native American ancestors. That awareness is spreading as people write down the oral histories of their family. In fact, we'll just hold up hands. How many folks in this room have oral histories, family genealogical information that states that they may have Native American blood? I'd say at least 1/3, 33%, something like that, just in this one room. It's a difficult process. It's a difficult road to go if you're going to try to find proof of your Native American heritage. Genealogically speaking, they were too smart to admit to being Indians. The Indian people were too smart to admit that. If they could pass for white, they would definitely do so. And they built white churches. They wore white clothes. And they did not even tell their children and grandchildren that they had Native American ancestry. That is a typical thing in a lot of families, my family included. My story is that much later, after the tribes have been forced out of our area, my grandfather's from Putnam County. And in that area, a young Native American man came back from the West looking for things that he knew might be buried in those areas there where his people had once been. The situation was he fell in love with the girl that he was staying with at a house, and the next thing you know, she's pregnant. The next thing you know, the white men are running him out of the area. He even wrote back letters to this young girl saying that he was going to come back and get her. And of course he never could. He would be killed. The interesting part is that those letters were saved by some of my great aunts, and they saved those letters for a long time until somebody decided, oh, we better burn those letters. And they burned all those letters. Now, a story like this is not the kind of story I can prove. It's only a story told me by my grandmother and grandfather. That's all it is. And I also want to go into the fact that when somebody says, my great-grandmother was full-blooded Cherokee, well, you know, that is a term that shouldn't be bandied about much. Full-blooded Cherokee. The great-great-great-grandfather ran off to the Shawnee tribe, got a girl, brought her back, and stuck her in the Cherokee tribe. Exactly who's full-blooded Cherokee? You see what I'm trying to point out. I also want to recommend, start thinking about what's a full-blooded Scotsman. Anybody figure that one out? No, there's no way to figure that out. I'm simply trying to point out that those references are oftentimes ambiguous and not to be taken at full value. I also want to say that when you hear the word princess and those kind of things, naturally that's just a word for a Native American woman. It doesn't mean that she was part of a royal family in the Cherokee tribe. A lot of people think that though, because it gives it a more acceptable air when you're dealing with white folks later. Oh, she was a Cherokee princess. Sounds better, doesn't it? Yeah. Contact with our native tribes was first made not by settlers, but by traders and trappers that quickly married into the tribe to gain trading rights. This is why you see so many Scottish names as chiefs of the Cherokees, Chief John Ross, just as an example. The fact, of course, is too that slaves brought into the eastern seaboard oftentimes immediately escaped over into the tribes, taken in by the tribes. One reason is they might be able to speak English and can serve as interpreters with traders, can serve as agents or go-betweens. These black folks quickly became part of the tribe, accepted in. You also have the fact that the Cherokee people, in a desperate attempt during the 1810, 1820s, tried to look as white as possible, tried to build plantations. They made so much money because they were good farmers, they sent their sons to Harvard and Yale. The situation was one where they even bought thousands of slaves to work these plantations. Those folks were growing good corn and good cotton right there in Georgia and Tennessee and over into South Carolina, and that's why the white folks wanted their land, because it was such good farmland. They had taken such good care of it. But that did mean that they did things like buy slaves. I'm just pointing that out naturally. I wish to also move on and mention, I've just received some information on them. You've heard of the Melungeon people. Has anybody here heard of the Melungeon folks? Another good percentage. The Melungeon people are a very interesting mixed race people that have received a lot of attention over the past 20 years. They have their own groups now formed, and I am going to state that when we use the term Melungeon, there are two ways to use it. And one way is just the general reality that that is a name for mixed race people. There are Melungeon people in New York. There are Melungeon people in Texas. That is a establishment of that's trying to point out that there could be Indian, white, and black blood in that Melungeon clan. You see what I'm trying to say? The other term for Melungeon, and some Melungeon people desperately want you to hold on to this, is the fact that the Melungeon area is actually right down in the meeting area between Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Those hills have contained a Melungeon population clear back since the 1820s. And they claim that name now very proudly, and I can understand that. But it can be used either way, a general racial designation of mixed race or a specific area. I think a lot of those folks are beginning to realize too, as they do tests, that the Melungeon people have much more African American blood than they were originally willing to admit. And that's an important point, I think, because they are now facing the facts. They are now seeing that when on the census it says Negro or black or mulatto, that very possibly could be part Indian, part white, part Native, part African American. So those are facts that need to be faced, and I think it's an exciting time period. This brings me to the question of DNA. The testing that we've all heard about, DNA testing. I will admit that I have waited until now to try this because I think the testing has improved over the past 5 years. and that the price is coming down. So I would think that you could spend $200 to $1,000, and that's affordable for some folks. And that type of testing will give you at least some ideas about your Native American possible genetic combinations. The DNA test can show you haploid groups, which are like massive family trees, some being specific to Indian populations. I am not sure how close these can put you to, literally, to a specific tribe. Maybe if you spend $1,000 instead of $200, they would run more tests for you. They would check out more genetic combinations. I don't know. So I can only say that I do have articles about it, and that you can go online and see a vast amount of information about DNA testing now. Maybe y'all have seen some. I would be suspect if it sounded too easy or too cheap. That's all I can say. I also want to say that, how do you feel about percentages? What is your reaction if you're told you are 12% Native American? You can see how this means something to you, but I'm just saying that it's your own individual decision of what that means to you. I look on our Native American heritage as one that's also cultural, that's very inclusive in many ways, that we look on as a prideful factor, even though we may have very little Native American genetic blood in us. So consider that as you read your test. I'm hoping that some of you will take that test. I would advise using this tool only as a way to find out about your genetic heritage, not with some hope of gaining access to tribes or the possibility of government assistance. I don't think that's really equitable right now. And I do know that many tribes will not accept DNA testing only. That's just not in their book. They want you to have great-grandmothers, great-grandfathers that are connected to Indian tribes. And that's a very difficult thing for many of us. And the DNA testing itself will not automatically let you into any tribe. So remember that when you go to get your test. But I would advise doing it. As you look online, you may find a whole variety of choices. I'm not even sure how many there are out there. You put in Native American DNA testing and you'll get a whole bunch of hits there. So one of the interesting areas of research when we talk about doing West Virginia Native American genealogical research is right here in your state archives. I always tell people this building belongs to you. This is not somebody else's building that you're visiting. This is your building. Your birth, death, deeds, marriage records, and especially census records are right here at your fingertips. If there's information that can lead you back to Native American heritage, it may be found right here. And our archive staff that I'm very proud of, the staff has put online, and y'all probably have gone to their online site that has births, marriages, deaths right there at your fingertips. So I advise using that. One of the interesting things that I think that can oftentimes lead people straight to a revelation is the 1900 census. In the 1900 census, the federal census takers did allow Indian people to claim their heritage. They were hoping to get part of the federal stipend that had been awarded to the Cherokee. After the Cherokee had a legal battle of 30 years, of course, the government knew they owed them the money the whole time. But when the word was spread, everybody was Cherokee. And there are thousands upon thousands of names. We have several books on this 1900 census, both accepted, and this book is on the rejected. There are 3 full volumes here. These volumes are interesting because they do list the great-grandparents right on here. If you're lucky, you might find an application from West Virginia that has a family name you recognize, and that would be a good find, even though they were rejected. The feds, of course, didn't want to give money to anybody. But I would look at that 1900 census. On the 1900 census, 2,400 people claimed to be Native American. 2,400 or over. Only 10 years later, guess how many Native Americans there are on the federal census? 7. 7. In other words, the feds quickly realized, cut this out. We don't want to find any Indians living here. They didn't want to find Indians because they knew they had broken every treaty they ever wrote with the Indians, and that Indians had legal status if they could prove that there was a variety of federal programs that they were not being awarded. Those kind of things quickly set in. They didn't want to find Indians. And that's a tragedy because that would have allowed a lot of folks to find their Native American roots. But after 10 years, the number goes from 2,400 to 7. And I can show that to you on the thing right over here. I also feel that you should remember, if your census records state Negro, mulatto, or black, you have an instant suspicion that you could have either mixed race or Native American blood, because the census takers didn't want to find Indians. They're not going to write it down on the list. They don't want to find Indians. Why would they want to find Indians? They don't want to find Indians. Meanwhile, Indian people are very adverse as to admitting that they have Indian ancestry. So you're not going to find a lot of folks in the census records from 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880, and you skip 1890 because that was burned in a fire. You go to 1900. Only when you get to the 1900 census are you going to find some of that information. The folks here can show you exactly how to look up these census records. It's not difficult, and it's fairly quick and easy now that we have these magical machines. I feel that the renewed interest in Native American culture over the past 30 years has coincided with a decline in the respect we have for our own culture's failures. Many people feel that our modern society's goals and religions are spiritually bankrupt and no longer appealing. This has caused a nostalgia for simpler times and a closer connection with nature and community as represented in the Native American mythos. I sympathize with this desire. I also want to support the many Native American groups that have stood up for Indian political rights and have tried to maintain Indian cultural practices and skills. We can see this in the many powwows and cultural gatherings that happen each year here in West Virginia. Sheets up here if anybody wants to read about DNA testing. And I've got some right here if somebody would like some. So, oh my God, look at that. Oh, that is a beautiful axe head. It could be ceremonial, but you see what they've done is they put a big, giant wooden thing right up on both sides of that. They strap it on there, and this would have been a war axe or a ceremonial axe. That I would not be willing to tell you because the folks here can. They can tell you, yes, you need to bring it over to the folks over at the archaeologists over on the other side of the building. They will help you. I guarantee that. They would love to see that because that's a very valuable piece of work there. And my mother has one like that. Yes. Very pretty. Folks, I'm sorry we had to do so much in and out, and we have plenty of time. We can talk for a while. I know there are some questions, and I'd like to have people pull up closer if you wish. There are seats you can get closer now. Move up and get closer to us so we don't have to yell at each other. If y'all want to move up, you can. And we also have more stuff to pass out. Let's start right here with this gentleman here. you're referring to the possible influence of Mayan influence found on the coast of Georgia, there in that area. It's all very interesting. Mayan and Olmec and even South American Indians that may have come across in canoes to Florida. Those are interesting questions, but I can't give you any specific information on that. What I can say is that I think there was influence from the Olmecs and the Mexicans all the way up into the Mississippi Valley because of the building of the mounds, because of the burials with artifacts, and because some of the symbols. So, you know, that's my opinion. So, I know we got 1,000 questions. Yes, ma'am.
I don't have any Indian blood in me, but I have some family history that's always intrigued me. My great-great-great-great-grandfather's family was attacked and some of them kidnapped by Tecumseh and scouts up in Jamelou in 1792.
Yeah.
And one of them was a young boy, George Wagner, who went over and lived with them in they said the Northwest Territory. And then his father, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, when relationships between the whites and the Indians cooled down, kidnapped his son back and kept him in Jamelou. And his Indian wife was looking for him. This was 20 years later that this happened. And I've often heard people say that, and this was a statement from Joy Gilchrist, who did the Lewis County.
Yes, I know Joy.
That Tecumseh really did not come from originally Chillicothe. That his people were driven there. That actually closer to Jamelou is where Tecumseh was from. Have you heard this?
Unfortunately, everybody claims they had Tecumseh born in their area. So there are no easy ways to prove where his birth took place. I am a follower of probably southern Ohio, but I cannot say that anyone has proven conclusively. But your interesting story, and I hope people heard that, one of her great-great-great-grandfather was kidnapped by the Shawnee and then was re-kidnapped back into the white population, which I have heard many times. The stories of white captives are very interesting because oftentimes the women that were captured as young girls later on, once they have married into the Shawnee tribe or the Wyandots or the Delawares, oftentimes want to stay with the Indian tribes because they prefer the life that they had in the Indian area as opposed to the life they had with the white culture. Indian respected women in a different way, and I can only say that that story is repeated many times. But the fact is that oftentimes treaty rights would only be started if the Indians brought back all their captives. And many times you had, white captives, blonde hair, blue eyes, desperately trying to stay with their Indian tribes. Then you had the, stories, of course, of people that were desperately trying to get back to their white tribes. Mary Ingall's story is one of those, of course, but that's a very interesting story, and you should write that down.
It's been written down several times.
Good. It is in several books. Well, I'm just saying that your personal connection and your family connection with it should be written down as a history. So, anybody else? Any other questions?
I have one for you.
Herc. I love that name.
You say you're Putnam County.
That's correct.
And which nation are you from? You're Shawnee, the Shawnee?
I am only presuming to be Shawnee or Cherokee because that is the most likely, not because I know.
Okay.
The
other question, and you mentioned about the buffalo. I was in Buffalo for about 7-8 years, and I understand that, and I was down there when the Shawnee got that cemetery down there all put together. Now, all understand that that town was named Buffalo because there was a buffalo crossing there. There was a shoals there around Red House. That, now are you?
That is my understanding also. That's my understanding also, but like I say, these are, there's questions about any of this. When you think about the number of buffalo that you'd have to make crossings or trails or whatever. I think there were many buffalo here, but they were quickly killed off. Once the fur trade had killed all the deer, which the Indians suddenly discovered that they killed all the deer, they killed all the buffalo also.
And what was the name of that tribe that was there, that cemetery, where they found that?
To be quite frank, I don't think you can place any name on those people. I think those people are mysterious because they could have been pre-Shawnee, they could have been pre-Cherokee. Those are grave sites that there's many people there, that could have been Monacan, Saponi, Tutelo. It could be any number of possible gravesite areas because both Adena and Hopewell were also in that area. So I can't answer that question there for sure. They're studying those bones still. I wish they'd come up with a better answer.
Well, that last hour when I talked to those people down there, they had the bones over to Ohio State, I think.
Well,
And
there
the box in the basement over there.
there are many stories about those bones.
Trying to get those bones back to
That's-
Virginia where.
That's correct. That
Census study.
That is correct, and it seems to me like it'd be a win-win situation for the state of West Virginia to be able to establish a Native American educational site there, have a place where tourists could come and look, and it's owned by APCO, I believe. And it would be good for them to have their publicity, there. I don't know why they haven't gotten that together, and I'll tell you the one reason I think, they don't want to spend any money.
Well, and the other reason is it's a closed society.
Well, I'm only referring to the fact that if you spend money on Native Americans at one site, you might have to spend money on them at another site, And I think it's just prejudice, just plain and simple. They're just prejudice against Native people. That's my take on it. Yes, sir.
Something about back during Handsome Lake's time. He done a lot of preaching in buildings like churches.
Yeah.
And the demise of the Native American culture and people were the white man's drink. He also went as boldly to call it the devil's drink. And that has been one of the biggest demise why the white culture overcame the Native
Yes, I agree. Demon rum. He is referring to the famous Iroquois prophet, Handsome Lake, a very influential figure and a person who was followed by Indians all over the eastern and northeastern area. Handsome Lake has many histories written about him, and I advise reading some of those. I believe he was Seneca or Cayuga, now I don't know for sure, but one of the Iroquois tribes, and Handsome Lake was Onondaga probably, but he was a very famous prophet. I also, would remind folks that Tecumseh's brother was also a prophet, the prophet of the Shawnee, and he took some of Handsome Lake's theories, and religious precepts, and used that before the War of 1812 to unify Shawnee resistance. So, who else?
I was wondering what your opinion was on the canal and the Madonna and the walls at Paint Creek and across from
On the Madonna, I am one of those that I think it's a much later creation. That's my personal opinion. I'm not an expert on it. And when you find areas that have walls and or what appears to be mounds or Native American possible sites, I think those should all be investigated. But some will be found to be real and some not. I can remember that petroglyphs found in Putnam County, of course, were later found to be, some kids in the 1930s scratched them on there. I'm just stating that it has to be studied by the archaeologists. But there are many, many sites all across West Virginia. And I hate to think of all the mound sites in our valleys that have been plowed under by farmers. Because that's where the Indians had their ceremonial sites, their cornfields, or what, they're plowed under by farmers. And that's happened for 100 years. I have seen those, and I feel those are genuine, and they're very interesting. I wish we could save those. They're close to the railroad tracks. I almost wish they could bring a big crane out and save those rocks. I wish they were right here in front of our culture center. And that's my opinion, of course. Nobody listens to my opinion, I'm sure, especially here at the culture center. I only worked for 23 years here. They learned to not pay any attention to me. I often came up with different ideas, and that is a very interesting site at Salt Rock. The petroglyphs are visible. Unfortunately, they're not protected. Unfortunately, in the next 50 years, they will have melted away. It's right off one of the main roads, and it's along a railroad embankment. Like I say, and you've been there.
They're in the park. I know they have them down there in Louisiana.
Well, this brings up the point, though, that if you are going to look at Native American sites on other people's property, be sure and get the information, from them that you can go on their property. That's important, because there are many sites that should be saved, but private property, that's a problem. Trying to get even into view these sites. Anyone else? More? Go right ahead, sir.
Hey, I got something. I just want to back up something that you said earlier. This is my great grandfather in Putnam County, and he was a coal miner in Raymond City mines, Plymouth mines, and Poker River and Eagle Hole Holler mines.
Yes, sir.
Kelly's Creek and Harmon's Creek up in there. Well, that's where we was from. And anyway, it says, and this is an old newspaper article. And it says, it's telling the story about, it says how hard it was back in and everything. And it says who their name was. It says, pictured is Johnny Page, that was my great-grandfather. Oldest daughter's Cloudy Page, that's my grandmother. But in this article, it says, tells about them being the coal miners and how hard it was, and says another children, Elvin, that tells all the children. But in this, it says, I keep wondering where the mother is. She's not in the picture. Okay, and right here's a picture of her mother. She was an Indian.
Yeah.
And that's why she's not in the picture.
That's correct. It happens in many photographs that I've seen also.
See, the newspaper people wouldn't put her in there.
That's correct.
And right here's her name, and her name is ICM Page.
What year is that newspaper?
I don't know what year it is, but she was born in 1879. And
So-
It was about 1920.
Yeah,
It was 1920.
You're looking at literally the exact rise of the KKK.
oh, it is. It says 1920.
The KKK was spreading all over the United States.
But you can see her. You can see her.
That means that they were afraid of a racial designation on
Right.
them.
They didn't put her in there, and we found that in a lot of
They
them.
did not want to, no.
And in the family Bible, she's in the family Bible as Indian.
And we'd like to copy that information, here for the archives. So when you leave, let us copy that, and we can put that in the
It's
archives.
amazing how that is in there. The way that, and here's our family, and we come up here and got this off the computer.
Good.
Okay.
And that's a census record?
Yeah, the census
Yep.
record. And then I got the 1920 census record, but there, one place on the computer, it says that she was, listed her as a,
Mulatto or?
no, a maid.
I mean,
Wouldn't list her as an Indian or even a white person.
well, it's interesting. I'm going to mention this, and of course, I want copies. I want copies of those before you leave, to put in the files here. But that story reminds me of somebody said, come over and check out this census record. I can't tell what this says. This is about 12 years ago. And innocently, I walked over to check the 1900 census record. I looked at the woman's name, and she was an Eskew, which I know is a Cherokee name because of my, repeatedly looking at genealogical information. And I was looking at her name, and there it was, race, I-N. And you don't see that very often. You do not see that very often. It had her down as a domestic, like a maid. That's what it was in reference to. It said that she had had 5 children and only 3 were living. There were no children listed. There were no husband listed. And she was in a household, and I looked up the list, and right there was my grandfather's name. And right above him was my great-grandfather's name. It was in their household. Those are the kinds of interesting things you find that you can't put much, knowledge to. I mean, I don't know where this woman was from or how she was connected to my family. I only know she's listed in the 1900 census as an Indian woman in my great-grandfather's household. That's all I know.
Yeah, I remember you showed us that a long time ago.
Yes.
About 10, 15 years ago, you told me.
It was an interesting find because I didn't know it until I saw it. Any other questions? Yes,
Are
ma'am.
some names then more associated with an Indian name? There was a gentleman here, and he didn't state it, he said he came across his name as Balls, and he said there was a lot of people with the last name Ball.
I can only say yes, there are many connections and connotations with a series of family names. But it could be anybody, though, in the sense that it's a very wide-ranging subject. But you go up into Barber County and you look at Norrises, and you'll find that they are probably Delaware Indians. So you look at the name Sizemore. Y'all know any Sizemores? Well, they have connections to the Cherokee people. And you will find them, for instance, right here in the book that I had earlier, had it out a second ago. There we go. I was just going to show people. Good. Did you find anybody in West Virginia? There are 2 more whole volumes of these too. So there's Sizemores right here in this book. And they are related to Walkers, for instance. And Walkers also have Cherokee connotations. But any name, Boggs or anybody else, has to be researched. It cannot be automatically assumed to have anything at all. They could all be from Norway, for all we know. And I'm just saying that. So, yes, sir.
You're talking about the Sizemore. My way back there was named Ned Sizemore.
Yes, Ned Sizemore.
And
Famous Native American family.
yeah, and he has a daughter that married a Hart, and that eventually came down to be my grandmother.
Yes, Herc, you may have mentioned that to me, and I probably told you.
You gave me that sheet of Sizemore.
Yes.
And I have not been able, there's in Wyoming,
Yeah.
to really connect them yet. And the only one I know down there that's still living is in Florida, and I can't get a hold of him, and he's a veteran.
Well, let me mention the fact that a lot of folks think that the Trail of Tears came right through West Virginia and went west, That is not the case. The Trail of Tears led straight across Tennessee and did not come into our area. But many of the Cherokee people didn't want to go west. And during the 1820s and the 1830s, they filtered up into the mountains of West Virginia. And they even, they went clear to Ripley and clear to, all over the southern counties. Many of the southern counties have Cherokee connections. And some of those folks are rather recent in the sense of 1820s and 1830s. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier about the lack of written language, which is pretty amazing in itself. But one thing that I've just never been able to fathom is,
the lack of mapping, and so that, there's this vast understanding of the geography and orientation, direction, all that. That's all that had to have been all up here, and I just can't seem to grasp how that could have been possible.
Well, if your people lived on the land for 5,000 years, you might get an idea of how they passed those star directions down to their children. But he's referring to the amazing way that native people have dealt with their environment. And I was referring to that earlier because I think they were land managers also. They built roads, they knew trails. They had trails go from here to St. Louis, They were capable of farming areas so large that when the white folks came, they literally thought that there must have been some Irish here or something, There are a whole series of theories about the mound builders. Y'all have heard some of them. Chinese, the lost tribes of Israel. It goes on and on and on. Of course, they were Native Americans the entire time. And I can only say that some of those are rather comical. But anybody else? We have plenty of time. Yes, sir.
We've learned an awful lot about Indians, Indian cultures, and whatever. There's a lot more that we don't know than what we know not.
So true, yes.
One of the most intriguing things is about who are they racially. And Samuel L. Morrison says something like that they're a mixture of Mongoloid and something else. Now, there aren't Indians anywhere else in the world, so it means possibly they mixed here. Who did they mix with? When did they come? How far back does that go? And that's before, I believe, Cherokees and Iroquois and
certainly long before then. That's the controversial subject that I was trying to avoid. I mentioned that at the first of the speech because basically the studies are still being done.
We find evidence that they were here, and I believe the Midland, Texas site verifies that they were here somewhere in the neighborhood of 19,000 to 20,000 years ago.
Yes, there are a variety of theories about possible waves of immigration. Maybe as many as 3 separate and different waves of immigration.
Different people than anywhere else in the world.
That's correct also.
They mixed here, and they mixed long before the Columbian period.
Genetically speaking, you have the possibility of there being people over here even earlier than the Mongoloid races. Is it the Ainu? What's the name of that Japanese tribe on that island in northern Japan? Exactly. Those Ainu people are not Japanese descent, but they match genetically some of the bones they have discovered on the Washington coast. So it's...
Actually, the Japanese were very upset to find that there are traces they knew all throughout Japan.
Right.
Just in the northern islands.
I just meant that they weren't directly connected to Japanese
They were
genealogy.
actually the ancestors.
Oh, I see that it might have been the ancestors. And they may have mixed with Chinese. But I'm just pointing out, yes, that they are discovering a whole series of possible and interesting migrations. So, yes, sir.
This is kind of a backup to his question, but sort of in 2 points. And I know it's the thing you wanted to avoid, but have they found any Folsom points here in West Virginia? And I think the group that would have mixed in would have been the Folsom people, and there's some talk about them coming from Europe around the ice cap, like the Mongoloids came from the ice cap from the Pacific.
I would say that as far as Folsom points, you have a problem, and that's the fact that people could have traded Folsom points hundreds of years later. There's not an easy way to pinpoint Folsom points here in West Virginia. I'm not an expert on the arrowheads here, so I can only say that I would refer that question to the archaeologists over on the other side of the building. Maybe you know something.
We don't know what they are.
I see. You don't know what kind of points. We don't know what kind of points they are. Yes, those points are interesting.
This is,
That's fluid, huh? Yes, yeah.
this is what I have in my pocket, that is yours, that's standard, that's 7,000 BC, and this is
Well, in fact,
So if you want to pass it on.
yeah, well, what I want you to do is you take these and show them to folks back there, because he has some interesting arrowheads to look at right here. If anybody wants to see them, that's West Virginia arrowheads. But I can't answer the question about whether we have any, in quotes, official Folsom points here. Any other questions? Surely there's something more. Yes, sir.
I was talking to a friend of mine today, and I invited him to travel with my wife and I tonight, but he didn't.
All his cousins
He
did.
was telling me that when he was a boy, up in the East End.
They got a flute right in there.
There was a fellow that would build flower gardens.
Yes.
It's on West
Very
Virginia.
deep well.
Uh-huh.
And he was going through and he came across an area that was just nothing but dust. And they dug deeper and found out that there had been, that had been a site of where they had camped out
Huh.
Indians, and the area was just full of arrowheads.
Huh.
He had a whole box full of them.
And that was probably in a river valley or somewhere along a creek bed or a river valley.
Yes, it was right close to the Canal River.
Yeah, yeah. The Kanawha has so many Native American sites that I've heard stories just like that one. And an old farmer friend of mine said he was plowing, you know, and there it was. He found a beautiful spear point. You know, it was like amazing. You know, he was just so excited, you know. He laid that spear point down and finished his plowing, you know, and he came back to get it, and of course he had plowed it under again. So he plowed it up there. Yes, sir.
Did you all get a copy of the Corps Engineers report on the Marmot locks when they found that village?
We do have a copy upstairs, and we also have a very interesting series of documentary films about the digs here in West Virginia. And one is called Redstone, and oh God, I'm trying to remember the name of the film now.
Red Salt and Reynolds.
And Reynolds. Red Salt and Reynolds is another documentary that Bob Maslowski has worked on. And it's available right here in your local libraries. You can get it. It's very interesting. They have 3 different films about the various digs here in West Virginia. The last one is the best, and they're all good. I can verify that, and you can ask for them at your library. Well, it's 10 to 8, folks. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And the family history was Indian. And they all filed their claims. They were all rejected. That was in like 1908.
Yeah.
So probably the only way that you could prove anything about any Jewish was through DNA under those circumstances.
That's probably correct, but I'm going to ask you if you have actually seen the rejected claim and you've got a copy of it. I have a copy of one of the Sizemore claims and seen it. It helps sometimes to figure out some genealogical connections. But your DNA study, just like mine, is the next thing to do. I'm going to spend some money, and I'm going to have the DNA test done, and I may be part, you know, librarian. I'm not sure what to do yet. I'm studying the issue, and I want to. That's correct, which could be the more reliable source. She's advocating the National Geographic DNA test because it's putting in information into a large bank. Also helps other people try to find out their heritage also. So I would recommend that too. I'll probably look that up.
Let's
Yes,
give
ma'am.
another hand to